There is a lot of advice online for free to help you become fluent. But what if that advice isn't helping you? What if that advice is actually preventing you from becoming fluent? A lot of students come to me because they're struggling with their fluency. They can't speak confidently, they can't understand native speakers, they're frustrated and they're stuck. They spend a lot of time trying to become fluent, but it's just not working. In this video, I'm going to share some horrible advice that I see online that's preventing you from becoming fluent. First, let's talk about grammar. Of course, you need correct grammar, correct sentence structure in order to form sentences. But I see a lot of advice online that tells students that they need to memorize all verb tenses. Or I see videos where you need to learn all verb tenses and use them in a specific period of time. But did you know that native speakers don't communicate with many of the verb tenses that exist? So if you spend all your time studying these verb tenses, but then you go to speak and you don't actually need these verb tenses in your speech, that time you spend studying isn't helping you. The reality is that the majority of our speech, 90% of native speakers' speech, comes from about 5 different verb tenses. You would be a lot better off mastering these 5 verb tenses and learning how to use them fluently and confidently rather than overwhelming yourself by trying to master every verb tense in English. Now let's talk about vocabulary. Again, of course, you need words. You can't communicate without words. You need a wide range of vocabulary. But do you need to memorize a list of words that all start with A? Do you need to memorize all the phrasal verbs with the word down? And this is where I see a lot of students make mistakes. They get overwhelmed by downloading a list of 20 phrasal verbs with down, or 50 or 100 phrasal verbs with down. And they think they need to memorize them all at once, and somehow knowing all these phrasal verbs with down will help you communicate. But when you're in a meeting, when you're in your IELTS, when you're having a natural conversation, how likely is it that you're going to use all those phrasal verbs with down? And that's the mistake, is memorizing random lists of words rather than focusing on full expressions, full phrases that you can use to communicate in the most common situations that you need to communicate in. Let's keep talking about vocabulary, because a lot of advice I see online tells you that you need to replace an everyday word with an advanced C1 word. Again, this is creating a lot of overwhelm and frustration for students, and they think that they aren't fluent, they can't communicate because their vocabulary is filled with more everyday words rather than advanced C1 words. Now, the reality is that yes, C1 words, advanced vocabulary can be very helpful to you, but in extremely specific situations, like when you're in a job interview, which happens maybe a few times a year, and then you don't go to another job interview again for 5 years or longer, or when you're taking your IELTS or a language exam, or if you're giving a very formal presentation. Yes, this vocabulary can be helpful, but you have to remember that 99% of the time, you are communicating in the real world. And 99% of the time, you don't need to use these C1 words. So don't overwhelm yourself by thinking you need to replace the vocabulary you have now with more advanced vocabulary. That simply isn't true. Now let's talk about your expectations, because online, I see a lot that suggests you can't make mistakes when you're speaking. If you make grammar mistakes or if you have an accent, that you won't be able to pass your IELTS, you won't be able to get a job in an English-speaking country, you won't be taken seriously by native speakers. But that is creating stress and overwhelm because it simply is not true and it's not helping you. You absolutely can make mistakes. And not only can you make mistakes, you absolutely will make mistakes. It's guaranteed that you will make mistakes when speaking English because it's not your first language. And the reality is you make mistakes in your first language as well. So of course you'll also make mistakes in additional languages that you've learned. That's okay. But a lot of the time, students think that they can't make mistakes, or if they're making mistakes, they're not ready. They're not ready to apply for that job. They're not ready to take the IELTS. And there's this advice out there suggesting that you need to wait. You need to wait to take your IELTS, to apply for a job, to try to move to an English-speaking country, to just use your English in social situations. You need to wait until you've learned all the verb tenses, until you've learned C1 vocabulary, until you've replaced all your regular verbs with phrasal verbs, until you've eliminated your accent. But that just simply is not true. And what this advice does, and if students accept this as the truth, what it does is it creates this situation where students are just focusing on input. And they're getting input, input, input. They're consuming the language, but they're not using the language. They're not getting output because they feel they're not ready. They feel their English isn't good enough. But this is a mistake. You need to start getting output, start using your English through speaking, writing from day one, right from a beginner. And if you're not a beginner, if you've already been learning English for many years, well then start today. Don't even wait until tomorrow. The second you finish this video, you can start changing that by using your English. And I see a lot of advice online that suggests that you're going to get to some point in the future where you'll be finished learning English. But that is also just not true, and it sets this expectation that, again, you need to wait now because your English isn't good enough now. When you get to this undetermined point in the future, then your English will be good enough. Then you can start speaking, applying for jobs, or pass your IELTS. But the thing is, there is no point in the future. You will always be trying to improve your English. You're a lifelong learner, so you need to accept that where you are today is where you are today, is what your level is now, and you need to start communicating with the language you have and just make effort every day, small effort every day to improve and improve and improve. And as you go on, your level will get higher and higher, but you'll be communicating the entire time. So those are some mistakes that you want to avoid when you're learning that can create frustration, but in this lesson, you'll find a better method. So watch it right now.